They're calling it the vote that ends 43 days of chaos, but in the Democratic caucus, they're calling it something else. Surrender. 8 senators broke ranks 3 days ago, voted with Republicans for a deal that gave them nothing but promises, and now the party that held the line for 6 weeks is staring at a choice nobody wanted: vote yes and betray everything they fought for. Vote no and own the shutdown for another week while families keep bleeding. The House floor is packed for the first time since September, members who haven't seen each other in months now, forced to decide whether principle or pragmatism wins. In the back row, a freshman congresswoman's hands are shaking, not from nerves but from rage she's been swallowing since Monday night. Outside, reporters are already writing 2 versions of the story, one for each outcome. Inside, the clock's ticking towards 7 p.m., and nobody knows which version they'll file. This is what happens when the center collapses, and both sides discover that winning and losing look exactly the same. Senator Maria Chen knew the call was coming before a phone even buzzed. She'd watched the House reconvene that morning, watched members file into the chamber for the first time since September, and she'd counted votes in her head the way you count seconds between lightning and thunder, trying to gauge how close the storm really is. The text was from her chief of staff, 3 words that managed to contain an entire crisis. They're not happy. Chen didn't need to ask who they were. The progressive wing had been sending signals since Monday night when she and 7 other Democrats had crossed the aisle to advance the funding package that would end the shutdown, signals like missed calls that went unreturned, signals like colleagues who suddenly needed to be somewhere else when she entered the room, signals like the video that had gone viral overnight, a freshman congresswoman crying in a committee hearing while asking where the hell everyone had gone. Chen had voted yes because the math was simple and brutal: 43 days without paychecks, airport chaos that was getting worse by the hour, food assistance frozen for millions of families, and a president who'd made it clear he'd rather watch the country burn than give an inch on healthcare subsidies that Democrats have been demanding since October. The deal they'd cut wasn't good. Chen knew that. It was a promise to hold a vote on extending the subsidies, not a guarantee they'd pass, not even a guarantee the vote would happen before the subsidies expired at year's end. But it was something, and something was better than watching federal workers line up at food banks for another week while both parties played chicken with people's lives. At least, that's what she'd told herself on Monday night. By Wednesday afternoon, she wasn't so sure anymore. The House floor felt different today. Chen had watched on C-SPAN from her office, studying the body language of members who'd become strangers to each other over the 6 weeks of Speaker Johnson's power play. Some looked relieved, grateful that the nightmare was almost over. Others looked furious, their jaws set in that particular way that meant they were about to make someone pay for this. And a few, the ones that worried Chen most, looked resigned, like they'd already accepted that nothing they did here mattered because the system was broken beyond repair. She'd seen that look before on the faces of people who'd stopped believing that government could work. It was the look that came right before you gave up entirely, and once you gave up, there was no coming back from that. Her phone rang again, a number she didn't recognize, but a DC area code that meant someone wanted something. She answered anyway, because that's what you do when you're one of 8 senators who just became the most hated people in your own party. Senator Chen, this is Ramirez from Politico. Got a minute to talk about Monday's vote? Chen closed her eyes and counted to 3, a trick her therapist had taught her back when she first got elected and discovered that public service mostly meant getting attacked by people who'd never met you. Not today. Talk to my press secretary. She hung up before he could follow up, but she knew there'd be more calls, more reporters asking her to explain why she'd betrayed her party, why she'd given away leverage for nothing, why she couldn't have held out just one more week. The truth was messier than any soundbite could capture. Chen had held out for 6 weeks. She voted no on every previous attempt to reopen the government without addressing health care. She'd given speeches on the Senate floor about the millions of Americans who'd see their premiums double if Congress didn't act. She'd met with constituents who were terrified about losing coverage, listened to small business owners who said they couldn't afford to keep insuring their employees if the subsidies expired. And then, on Sunday night, she'd sat in a closed-door meeting with Senate leadership and heard the reality she'd been trying not to face. They didn't have the votes to force a better deal, and if they kept holding out, the only people who'd suffer were the federal workers who'd already gone without paychecks for 6 weeks. So she'd made a choice. Not a good choice. There were no good choices left. But the least bad option in a situation where every option was some shade of catastrophic. And now she was paying for it in ways she'd understood intellectually, but hadn't really felt until this morning when she'd walked into the Senate cafeteria and 3 colleagues had literally turned their backs on her. Not metaphorically. Actually turned around and walked the other direction, like she carried some contagion they couldn't risk catching. That's when Chen realized this wasn't just about one vote. This was about something deeper, something that had been building for years and had finally found the right catalyst to explode. The Democratic Party was eating itself alive. The moderates like Chen believed in incremental progress and cutting deals that moved the ball forward even if they didn't score touchdowns. The progressives believed that compromising with Republicans was surrender, that the only way to win was to make the other side hurt so much they had no choice but to cave. Both sides thought they were right, both sides had evidence to support their position, and neither side could admit that maybe, just maybe, they needed each other to survive what was coming. Chen thought about the freshman congresswoman in that video, the one who'd cried while asking where her Republican colleagues had gone, Melanie Stansbury, representing New Mexico, brand new to Congress, and already learning the hardest lesson this place had to teach. Sometimes the people who are supposed to be on your side are the ones who hurt you most. Chen had met Stansbury once at a caucus meeting back in September, and she'd seen in the younger woman's eyes the same idealism Chen used to carry before this job, grounded down to something harder and more cynical. She wondered if Stansbury would make it through a full term without losing that spark, or if she'd become another casualty of a system that rewarded performance over substance. The House debate had started around 4, and Chen tuned in on the small TV in her office, watching members make speeches that had been written days ago, before anyone knew whether this vote would actually happen. Hakeem Jeffries went first, and his message was careful, calibrated to thread an impossible needle. He condemned the deal as inadequate, while acknowledging that Democrats would do what they had to do to end the suffering of federal workers. He promised that the fight for health care wasn't over, that they'd keep pushing even after this vote passed. And he made it clear, without saying it directly, that he remembered which senators had made this moment necessary, and that memory would last a very long time. Then came the progressives, one after another, each speech angrier than the last. Sarah McBride from Delaware called the Republican plan Trump care and got applause from half the chamber. Shamari Figures from Alabama said the shutdown had been worth it. Hell yes, it was worth it, because standing up for health care was worth any cost. And when he said that, Chen felt something twist in her chest because she knew what he meant, and she also knew he was wrong. Or maybe she was wrong. Or maybe they were both wrong. That was the thing about this job, you could never be sure, and by the time you figured it out, it was too late to change your vote. The Republicans were quieter, more subdued, like they knew they'd won, but weren't sure what they'd actually won. Speaker Johnson gave a speech about fiscal responsibility that would have been more convincing if he hadn't just presided over the longest shutdown in American history, one that had cost the economy billions and accomplished exactly nothing except proving that both parties could be equally stubborn. A few GOP members expressed concern about a provision that would let senators sue if the DOJ investigated them, something Chen hadn't even known was in the bill until yesterday. One more reminder that deals made at 3 in the morning rarely produce good policy. She checked her watch. 5:30, 90 minutes until the vote. Time was doing that thing it does when you're waiting for something terrible and inevitable, stretching out so every minute feels like an hour while somehow also moving too fast to stop. Chen thought about the 8 of them, the senators who'd voted yes on Monday night. They hadn't coordinated, hadn't made a pact or signed some pledge. They'd just each come to the same conclusion independently. This had to end and nobody else was going to end it, so they would, but independence didn't matter now. They were a bloc, a symbol, the 8 senators who'd broken ranks and broken faith, depending on who was telling the story. She knew some of their names would be in primary challenges by next week, knew that activists who'd supported them for years would turn on them like they'd been secretly working for the other side all along, knew that the trust they built with their base years of voting the right way, fighting the right fights, showing up when it mattered, would be erased by this one vote, this one compromise that would define them for the rest of their careers, whether they liked it or not. That's what happened when you stepped out of line. The line remembered, and it didn't forgive. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Tom Fletcher, one of the other 7, watching the floor. We did the right thing. Chen stared at the message, trying to decide if she believed it. She wanted to believe it. She'd built her entire career on the idea that being in Congress meant making hard choices, that leadership meant accepting responsibility for decisions that would make you unpopular with people you respected. But watching those speeches, seeing the anger and betrayal in the eyes of colleagues who'd stood beside her on every other vote, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Fletcher was wrong. Maybe they just traded short-term pain for long-term destruction of the fragile coalition that was the only thing standing between democracy and whatever came after. At 6 o'clock, the rules debate ended and the final speeches began. This was the last chance for members to make their case, to get their position on the record before the vote that would define the session. Chen watched a parade of faces she knew, voices she recognized, arguments she'd heard 100 times before. But underneath the familiar rhetoric, she heard something new. Exhaustion. Not the normal fatigue of a long session or a tough fight, but the deeper weariness that comes from starting to suspect that all of this, the speeches, the votes, the careful positioning, might not matter. because the whole enterprise was coming apart at the seams. A Republican from Tennessee stood up and said he'd prefer to fix Obamacare rather than extend the subsidies, which would have been funny if it wasn't so depressing. His party had spent 15 years trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act, and now they were going to own the political fallout when premiums doubled because they couldn't bring themselves to extend the subsidies that kept costs down. Chen almost felt sorry for them, but then she remembered that they'd had 6 weeks to cut a deal and had chosen instead to let the shutdown drag on while families suffered, so her sympathy only went so far. At 6:30, the presiding officer called for order and announced that voting would begin in 30 minutes. The chamber, which had been noisy with conversation and movement, suddenly went quiet. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the culmination of 43 days of chaos, and now that it was here, nobody seemed quite ready for it to arrive. Chen thought about the federal workers who'd be getting paychecks again, the airports that would stop canceling flights, the food benefits that would resume. She thought about the healthcare subsidies that wouldn't be extended, the premiums that would double, the small businesses that would drop coverage because they couldn't afford the new rates. And she thought about her daughter, who'd stopped answering her calls 3 days ago after seeing the news about Monday's vote. Her daughter, who worked for a progressive advocacy group and who'd grown up believing that politics was about fighting for what's right, not settling for what's possible. They'd had this argument before, mother and daughter, the eternal tension between idealism and pragmatism, but this time felt different. This time Chen wasn't sure she could explain her vote in a way that would make sense to someone who still believed that compromise was just another word for surrender. At 6:45, members started filling the chamber, those who'd been in their offices or the cloakroom now returning for the vote that would end the longest shutdown in American history. Chen watched them on the TV feed, studying their faces, trying to read who would vote yes and who would vote no and who was still deciding in these final minutes. She had done her own counting yesterday and come up with a number around 220 votes for passage, enough to clear the threshold, but not by much. Close enough that every vote mattered, that every member who walked onto that floor knew their choice would be remembered and recorded and probably used against them at some point. The freshmen looked at the most uncertain, unsure whether to follow their conscience or their caucus, their district or their donors. The veterans looked resigned, like they'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended, but had to watch it anyway because that was the job. And the leadership looked determined, faces set in expressions that said they'd made their decision and weren't interested in hearing arguments about whether it was the right one. That's what leadership meant in this place, making the call and living with the consequences, even when the consequences included watching your own party tear itself apart. Chen's chief of staff knocked on her door, poked his head in without waiting for an answer. They're about to vote. Thought you'd want to know. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He lingered for a moment, like he wanted to say something else, then thought better of it, and left. Chen appreciated that. She didn't need reassurance or validation right now. She needed to sit with her choice and accept that, right or wrong, it was hers to own. At 6:55, the presiding officer gavelled the chamber to order and announced that voting was open. The electronic board lit up, names appearing in green or red as members pressed their buttons. Chen watched the tally climb, watched the yes votes pile up faster than the no votes, watched the gap widen from 5 to 10 to 20. By 7:05, it was over, 228 to 207. The bill would go to the president's desk, the shutdown would end, and everyone would wake up tomorrow trying to figure out what had just happened and what it meant for everything that came after. The chamber erupted in a chaos of reactions, cheers from some, boos from others, shouted arguments between members who had held their tongues during the vote but couldn't contain themselves now. Chen watched Hakeem Jeffries stand at the front, his face carefully neutral, while progressive members surrounded him, demanding to know why he'd allowed this to happen. She watched Speaker Johnson shake hands with members of his caucus, his smile tight and joyless, the expression of someone who'd won a battle but wasn't sure about the war. And she watched Shamari Figures, the freshman from Alabama who'd said the shutdown was worth it, standing alone in his section, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on something nobody else could see. Then the cameras cut to the reporters in the gallery, and Chen saw them typing furiously, filing stories that had been half-written hours ago, just waiting for the final vote count to make them official. She wondered which narrative would win. Democrats caved to Republican pressure or bipartisan breakthrough and shutdown, and realized it didn't matter. Both stories were true. Both stories were incomplete, and neither story would capture what it felt like to sit in this office, watching your party fracture in real time, knowing you'd played a role in breaking something that might not ever get fixed. Her phone exploded with the notifications, texts, emails, missed calls piling up faster than she could process them. She ignored them all and kept watching the TV, watching members file out of the chamber, some in groups, some alone, some stopping to talk to reporters, while others kept their heads down and moved quickly toward the exits. The shutdown was over. The vote was done. And now came the hard part, living with what they'd all just done. Dan thought about calling her daughter, but didn't. What would she say? That she'd voted to enable this mess on Monday because she thought it was the right thing to do, even though right felt increasingly like a word that had lost all meaning. That she'd betrayed her party's core demand because she couldn't watch federal workers suffer for another week. That sometimes being a leader meant making choices that everybody hated, including yourself. Her daughter wouldn't want to hear that. Her daughter wanted heroes, not politicians who split the difference and called it courage. At 7:30, the president issued a statement praising Congress for ending the Democrat shutdown and promising to sign the bill immediately. Chen read it on her phone and felt nothing, not anger or frustration or even disappointment. Just a hollow recognition that this was how it would be spun, that the narrative would be shaped by whoever shouted loudest and longest, that the truth was too complicated to fit in a headline, so everyone would just pick the version that confirmed what they already believed. She turned off the TV and sat in the silence of her office, listening to the muffled sounds of staffers in the hallway, voices raised in conversation or argument, or maybe just relief that it was finally over. 43 days. The longest shutdown in American history. And what had they accomplished? Federal workers would get paid again. Airports would stabilize. Food benefits would resume. But the healthcare subsidies that had started this whole fight were still on track to expire in 6 weeks. Premiums would still double, and the trust between Democrats who'd held the line and Democrats who'd broken it was shattered beyond repair. Jen's mentor had once told her that the hardest votes were the ones where you couldn't tell the difference between principle and cowardice, where doing the right thing and taking the easy way out looked exactly the same from certain angles. She thought she understood what he meant, but she'd been wrong. Understanding came now in this moment, sitting alone in her office while her party tore itself apart and the country moved on to the next crisis without pausing to learn anything from this one. Her chief of staff knocked again, more tentative this time. Senator, there's a reporter from CNN in the lobby. Says they want to comment on the vote. Jen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was the job, not the speeches or the legislation or the behind-the-scenes negotiating. The real job was standing up after you'd made a choice that half the country hated, putting on your professional face, and explaining why you'd done what you'd done even though you weren't entirely sure anymore whether you'd done the right thing. Tell them I'll be down in 5 minutes, she said. Her chief nodded and left, and Chen stood up from her desk, straightened her jacket, and looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. She looked tired, older than she had 6 weeks ago. But she also looked like someone who had made a hard choice and was prepared to defend it, even if that defense would cost her everything she'd built. She thought about the federal worker who had thanked her in a grocery store last month, tears in his eyes because he didn't know how he'd feed his kids if the shutdown lasted another week. She thought about the small business owner who'd written to say that extending the subsidies was the only thing keeping her from dropping employee health care entirely. She thought about the progressive activists who'd supported her for years and were now calling for her head because she'd compromised instead of fighting to the bitter end. And she thought about what her daughter had said the last time they'd talked before the vote, before everything had fallen apart. Sometimes you have to lose to win later, Mom. Sometimes you have to be willing to watch it all burn down before you can build something better. Chen hadn't agreed then, and she wasn't sure she agreed now, but she understood why her daughter believed it, understood the appeal of that kind of clarity, that kind of certainty that sacrifice today would mean victory tomorrow. The problem was that Chen had been in this business long enough to know that tomorrow never came. Tomorrow was always one more compromise away, one more tough vote away, one more election cycle away. You kept telling yourself that next time would be different, that next time you'd have the leverage to demand more, that next time the other side would cave instead of you. But next time never arrived, and eventually you woke up and realized you'd spent your entire career preparing for a moment that was never going to come. She grabbed her phone and her briefcase and headed for the door. In the hallway, staffers stopped talking when they saw her, their faces carefully neutral, and Chen realized they didn't know what to say either. Congratulations felt wrong. Condolences felt worse. So they said nothing, and she walked past them toward the elevator, toward the reporter waiting in the lobby, toward whatever came next in a career that might have just ended even though she was still technically employed. The elevator was empty, which Chen was grateful for. She didn't want to make small talk, didn't want to smile and nod and pretend everything was fine when nothing was fine and maybe nothing would ever be fine again. She wrote down in silence, watching the floor numbers decrease, and tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent enough to say on camera. The reporter was young, eager, probably hoping this interview would be his big break. Chen recognized the look. She'd worn it herself once, back when she believed that being smart and working hard was enough to make a difference. Senator Chen, thanks for taking the time, he said, already signaling to his cameraman. A lot of people are calling Monday's vote a betrayal of democratic principles. How do you respond to that? Chen looked directly at the camera, at the lens that would carry her words to millions of people who'd already made up their minds about her, and she told the truth. We made a choice. Not a perfect choice, but the only choice that ended the suffering of 2 million Americans who'd gone 6 weeks without paychecks. If that's betrayal, then I guess I'm guilty, but I'd make the same choice again tomorrow. The reporter pressed her on health care, on the subsidies, on whether she'd been played by Republicans who'd promised to vote and might not deliver. Chen answered each question the same way, with honesty instead of spin, with acknowledgement of uncertainty instead of false confidence. She knew it wouldn't help, knew that nuance doesn't survive in a media environment optimized for outrage, but she said it anyway because maybe somewhere someone would hear it and understand that governing is complicated and compromise isn't surrender, and sometimes there are no good choices, just less bad ones. When the interview ended, Chen walked out of the Capitol building into the November night. The air was cold and sharp, and for the first time in 43 days, the government was open. Federal workers would get paychecks on Friday. Airports would return to normal by next week. Food benefits would resume before Thanksgiving. The shutdown was over. But as Chen walked to her car, past the protesters who'd gathered to chant about betrayal and surrender, past the reporters still filing stories about the vote, past the tourists who'd come to see democracy in action and gotten something messier and more honest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else had just begun. The party was fractured, the trust was broken, and the 2026 midterms were 13 months away, barely enough time to heal if healing was even possible. She got in her car and sat in the parking garage for a long time, engine off, phone buzzing with messages she didn't want to read. Tomorrow she'd have to face her colleagues, her constituents, her daughter. Tomorrow she'd have to start rebuilding bridges she'd burned and defending choices she'd made. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out whether she could survive in a party that increasingly had no room for people like her. But tonight, for just a few minutes, she sat in the silence and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. The shutdown was over. The vote was done. And Senator Maria Chen, one of the 8 Democrats who'd crossed the aisle to end it, was left wondering whether she'd save the country or help destroy it. The answer, she suspected, wouldn't be clear for a very long time, maybe not ever. And that uncertainty, more than anything else, was what made this job so impossibly hard. She started the engine and drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they had this morning, even though everything had changed. The Capitol receded in her rearview mirror, lit up against the night sky, a symbol of democracy that tonight felt more fragile than she'd ever imagined. The shutdown was over. But the real fight, the fight for the soul of the party, the fight about what compromise meant and whether principle was worth the cost, was just beginning. And Chen had a sinking feeling that this fight wouldn't end with a vote or a deal or any kind of resolution that made sense. It would just keep going, getting uglier and more destructive, until there was nothing left worth fighting for. But she'd still show up tomorrow. That's what you did when you'd taken the oath and made the commitment. You showed up, even when showing up meant getting torn apart. You did the work, even when the work felt pointless. You tried, even when trying wasn't enough, because the alternative was giving up entirely, and Maria Chen wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that stubborn refusal to quit, that insistence on showing up even when everyone hated you for it, might be the only kind of courage that mattered anymore.